announcement in the chat. Let me pull that up. So Abigail has put in the chat a link for everyone to sign in, just so we know who our actual attendees are, which is, as you guys know, different often from registrants. So I see many familiar names. We're tickled to have you all back. This is our third and final presentation in this ECHO series around laboratory genetic testing. And although for probably most of the audience, these ladies do not need any further introduction, for anyone who is new and joining us today, I want you to know a little bit about our presenters. So Julie Weedor is a certified genetic counselor, having over 9 years of experience in genetic services in laboratory, hospital, and health plan vendor settings. She is specialized in utilization management to increase access to appropriate genetic testing across healthcare. Her passions lie in speaking enthusiastically and effectively to multiple stakeholders while advocating for increased access to quality genetics care and forming partnerships between providers, institutions, health plans, and laboratories. Erin Beaver is a genetic counselor with over 9 years of clinical experience in the St. Louis, Missouri area, and including a year of industry experience. She's also the founder of Ingenuity, a genetic genealogy and counseling company. Erin currently works as a full-time clinical genetic counselor in oncology at BJC Healthcare, Missouri Baptist Medical Center Breast Healthcare Center. Previous to this position, the industry genomic testing position she had was with as a consultant with PerkinElmer Genomics. She's also worked as a clinical genetic counselor and genetic counseling supervisor at Mercy Hospital in St. Louis, and a clinical genetic counselor in fetal care at Washington University in St. Louis. In her free time, which always cracks me up, that phrase, Erin teaches at Washington University in the St. Louis Genetic Counseling Program, advises thesis students in the UAMS Genetic Counseling Program, and is a contract worker employee of Heartland Regional Genetics Network. Her research interests include the development of innovative models of care in genetics, public health communications, and addressing inequities and disparities in healthcare, especially as it relates to genetic services. So it's my pleasure to introduce these two ladies again to you, and I will turn it over to Erin.
Thank you, Lori. So just a few housekeeping items. Make sure that if you have not used the QR code or the attendance link in the chat, do go ahead and complete that now so that you are able to get credit for attending today's presentation. And then we have a couple of disclosures. Disclosures include that Julie, who is going to be assisting me in our presentation today, is a employee and holds stocks with Guardant Health. My disclosure is that I did work for PerkinElmer within the last year and was an employee. And then also my private company, Ingenuity LLC, is a consultant with Heartland Genetics. And then Lori, who's also been on the planning committee for the webinar, is an advisor to GeneDx. So we do have accreditation for continuing education units through the ECHO project, and this is also CEUs available through NSGC if you are a genetic counselor. At the end, if you are trying to seek credit for this particular presentation, there'll be some instructions on how to complete that. So watch for those. All right, now onto the learning objectives. So from today's presentation, what we hope that you get in the end is the ability to describe the type of sponsored testing programs that are available. We will be reviewing logistics of identifying and participating in programs. We're going to evaluate program characteristics and assess the impact of sponsored testing programs as a whole. Before we get too much into the sponsored testing, I want to make sure that people do know that we are aware that even when a genetic test is approved through insurance, that sometimes there's still a high out-of-pocket cost that the patient may have to pay, whether that's because of a high deductible or just other reasons. So if anybody is having trouble with how to help patients pay for an copay or co-insurance, there are actually resources to help alleviate that burden on families. And so here are two options that are available. So if you go to NORD, there's actually a list of a couple of different programs that are relevant to things like pediatric or rare disease. So you follow that QR code. The Patient Advocate Foundation for copay relief, they do have copay relief for oncology genetic testing services. And I've heard from others who have had success in getting this for their patients that it's very helpful. They have a number of other resources too that you can look at through that organization. So just a couple of places to help with that. So what we're going to be focusing the vast majority of our time on today is what do we do when we have a denial, but we really still need this genetic testing for our patient. This is the area of our toolkit that we're going to be focusing on. So one of the things that you could do when a patient has a denial is that the patient could pay out of pocket for the testing. And different people have different resources that are available for them and to them. So some patients may have the resources needed to pay that cost out of pocket, and that's something that you should have a candid discussion with your patient about. If you're working on the family side as a family advocate, that is something that families should be aware that they can do. That just because the insurance did not approve the test does not mean that they cannot go ahead and order and pay out of pocket. All right. There's also other routes of help through the state and through the insurance company that could be potentially helpful in those denial situations. So one of the things that you could do is to check with your individual state's Bureau of Special Healthcare Needs to see what resources are available. There may be funds that are community type funds that are available, like charitable funds. There may be other resources that they have available, but you never know until you check. So that's a good first spot to check as a provider or a patient. Another thing that the patients could do, and this is something that most of the time a doctor's office can't set it up for the patient, but they can help the patient to navigate to this, and that's to request a case manager within their insurance company. So whatever insurance company that they have, not all insurance companies have case managers, but many do. So they should call and ask about getting that set up in the process. And then once they have that case manager set up, then they can always look at a single case agreement request, which is something I did not know about until a couple of weeks ago. So this is a recent thing that I'm learning about, but something that is able to be requested. Another thing that patients could look at, this is usually through their employers, through their HR department, would be employee emergency funds, because sometimes those will cover where there's gaps in coverage of testing or where things have maybe been denied potentially. So that's an option. And then there are condition-specific support foundations. Another thing I would add in here is that some insurance companies do have a charitable side. A children's fund is what some of them will call it, but you can always ask the insurance company if they have a charitable resources foundation that's part of their company. There's one prominent one that I've had success with. Happy to share that with anybody offline. I just don't want to introduce any bias because the name of the foundation does go along with the insurance company that sponsors it. So some people may see that as a concern to advertise the name here.
And Erin, I know one of our attendees, Braden from Arkansas Children's Hospital, may have some familiarity at, at that institution. There was actually a donor-initiated fund that was earmarked to support genetic services. So sometimes there might even be institutional support that not, many folks are aware of. So you can also ask internally.
That's a really great point and a great transition. So different institutions will have either financial assistance for patients or, like you're talking about, like a pre-marked fund. So know your institution, like you said, know what resources are available within your institution. I would also point out that the laboratories that do genetic testing, many of those do have patient financial assistance programs as well. So if a patient is having to pay out of pocket, they may be able to apply for that. It usually is an application process. That most of them are based on a sliding scale, which means that the greater the need, the more the discount for testing. And the other thing is that some labs will require you to provide financial documents, others will not. So that kind of varies lab to lab. But within an institution, there are usually financial assistance programs, and also within laboratories, there are those financial assistance programs. But like you mentioned, Julie, there may also be charitable funds that are available within a healthcare system that you might want to be aware of, especially if it has something particular to do with genetics. All right, so this kind of moves into the meat of our discussion today, which is about sponsored testing. If you visit our toolkit for genetic testing, which is on the Heartland website, as you see here, you can follow that QR code. There's a spreadsheet that we keep there that we try to keep updated of all the currently known sponsored testing programs within our area. So if you don't see one that you know about when you go to visit that list, please reach out to us by email so that we can update that list. If you see something on the list that's no longer available, let us know, because we do want to keep that as up to date as possible. And it is a constantly changing front. But if you were to go and pull up that spreadsheet, which does tell you what labs are offering those sponsored testing, so we don't have a picture of the spreadsheet here because it would maybe be an issue regarding bias. So you should know, though, that we do have it broken down by area. So you can see here all the different clinical areas on our list that have available sponsored testing. So it's pretty vast. There's a few clinical areas that may not have some kind of sponsored testing available, but there's a lot of clinical areas which are covered. Now, when you're thinking about doing sponsored testing, you do kind of have to weigh the pros and cons for a given case. I don't think that sponsored testing is the best option for every case. I think that you really have to look at what is the value and what are you potentially giving up? And so this graphic here is just trying to help you walk through that. So some of the things that you want to think about with sponsored testing is, can it help to find a diagnosis? And you might need to take a look at what's your differential. What are the conditions that you are worried about for that particular patient? Are you able to rule any of those potentially out or in using a given sponsored test? Some you may have a sponsored test where it covers all of the conditions that are on your differential. For other conditions, you may have a sponsored test that covers one or two of those only. So take that differential into mind whenever you're looking at the sponsored testing options. So you could, from doing sponsored testing, you could find a diagnosis, which is very clear. It could potentially, if negative, rule out some of the diagnoses that you were thinking about. And it is free to patients. So sponsored testing really does typically mean free to patients. Now, that's not to say that the lab is offering that test free from their perspective. It's probably being paid for by another party. And we're going to talk about all the questions to ask when you're looking at that sponsored program. But just right now, we're talking about, is sponsored testing going to be helpful potentially to this patient or not? The potential cons is that the patient that you have in front of you may not necessarily meet the sponsored testing eligibility criteria. So you need to take a look at that criteria. Some are going to be very broad and some are going to be very specific. And they may have had abnormal metabolic labs, for example, or some kind of abnormal exam in a specific way to meet that criteria. Others may say, well, they just need to have a family history or personal history of this presentation, and that's good enough for our eligibility purposes. So take a look at the eligibility. Know that not all that glitters is gold. And what I mean by that is that there are times when you're going to have to ask questions about what is the purpose of this test? Why is it being offered as a sponsored test? Is it really going to cover the vast majority of what I need covered, or is the one or two things that are being covered by the sponsored test worth it? Worth the potential of finding something unexpected that may or may not be actionable because of the other things that are on the panel. So you really have to take a good look at the panel and what's on it and weigh that. And also understand, again, that some of these panels may not contain every gene that's relevant to that patient's presentation, but perhaps by ruling out some of these through a free test, we can then go back and have other options that are maybe more financially accessible to the patient if we just need to look at one or two other conditions. So just something to keep in mind when you're weighing this out. There are some questions that you should ask when you're looking at a particular sponsored testing program, or when a vendor is coming in to talk to you about a sponsored testing program. I will say that it is a common technique in industry to use the sponsored testing programs as a entrance into the door of your clinic. So a way to gain a conversation with you. And so again, during those moments, it's good to get the information and collect the facts, but you can ask some hard questions in that conversation. I would encourage you to ask some hard questions in that conversation. And some of those questions that you'll want to ask is, who is sponsoring the test? So who is paying for this? If the laboratory is not paying for it out of their own funds, or potentially maybe they're paying for it with a grant, then who is it? Typically what you're going to find is that it's a lot of pharmaceutical companies, but it is not always necessarily that. There are foundations, like patient support foundations, that sometimes sponsor testing. There are outside entities outside of pharmaceuticals or patient support that might be sponsoring testing. So just find out who it is that's sponsoring that testing. What is the motivation for that organization or group to be sponsoring the test? And we want to know that there's transparency there, right? We want to know who's maintaining the rights to the results in the sample. So who maintains the rights to the data that's being collected from these tests? Is that data shared with the sponsoring entity? And if so, how is it shared? And what data? Is it de-identified? Is it in a just like an aggregate type of data? What is that that's being shared? And what is the purpose of sharing that data? Now, the impact of sponsored testing, it is varied and vast. There are positive impacts of sponsored testing programs, and there are potentially negative impacts of sponsored testing programs. And in the grand scheme of healthcare and the role that we play within healthcare, it's good for us to think about what those impacts might be, because it does affect our community and it does affect our patients. So sometimes the impact of sponsored testing program is that what is happening is you're identifying patients that have a particular condition, so that those patients can potentially be recruited for upcoming clinical trials, usually around pharmaceuticals, but it could be around screening. So it doesn't always have to be around pharmaceuticals, but there's definitely a drive there. Sometimes the impact is identifying patients with a particular condition for them to be possible consumers of an already approved medication. And so that's why pharmaceutical companies may sponsor testing in certain circumstances. With the support foundations and sometimes other outside groups, the purpose may be research to better be able to describe a range of symptoms or natural history of a condition, get a better idea of the occurrence of that condition within the population, or within a subset of the population. So that can be another purpose to these sponsored tests. Another impact to be aware of is that having sponsored testing, the funds are coming from somewhere, and that's not always offset by the profits that you make from the medication or things like this. So it could actually increase the cost of things like pharmaceuticals, especially if it's being used for potential recruitment to clinical trials. So there could be downstream impacts to the cost of screenings or the cost of pharmaceuticals that are being marketed out of this research that's taking place. Now, outside of sponsored testing, there are other opportunities, and I would put these very much into the research opportunity for free testing. Now, the most widespread program that I know of that offers free testing to families is the Undiagnosed Disease Network, or the UDN. So that's a program out of the NIH. They do have various locations, but they are particular locations. It is an application process or program. So what that means is that the patient does have to apply. It is patient initiated, although it's provider supported in the sense that you as a provider may be asked to supply certain documents after the patient who has applied has signed a medical record release. But that patient then the application is reviewed, and if the patient is accepted into the program, then they go to a particular site, they're assigned to a site, and then they would be seen at that site, and they may be offered various kinds of testing as part of that program. And usually in that program, patients are given their test results. Not all research programs have the opportunity for the patient to receive their test results. And I would also say that not all research programs are done in such a way that that it's timely. So if it's a research opportunity that a patient is participating in for free testing, it could be months or years before they have the information from that particular project. So know that sometimes these research opportunities are not quick answers, but they can be more affordable and accessible answers than what we're working with if we have a denial from the insurance and no other options or resources. Particularly, I think the area that the Undiagnosed Disease Network is good at supplying testing for would be things like whole exome and whole genome testing. And a lot of the research these days that is being done on that basis, that free basis, is going to be in the area of whole genomes and whole exomes, but it's not exclusively that. So know the research opportunities that might be there within your own institution, especially if you work at an academic institution. Know what's available locally, but know that there are large research opportunities like the UDN that patients can access. And a good place to go is maybe if you suspect a specific condition, you might check that if there's any family support groups that are for that specific condition. They may have research posted as part of their just resources to families. So research opportunities are another way that patients can access testing for free. Other helpful resources that you might want to know about or take a look at is the Family Health Information Center. Sometimes there will be resources there that are available. And then also the National Genetics Education and Family Support Center. We are going to talk a little bit more about free family testing. So this really comes into play whenever you have a patient that they qualified for testing themselves and we were able to reach a diagnosis, or maybe a patient had carrier testing for a recessive condition, maybe that was prenatally or preconceptually, and we're trying to get testing for other family members or for a partner to better understand risks to the rest of the family. So there is the existence of some free family testing. Usually this is lab-based, meaning that each laboratory has their own process or their own rules and parameters around offering that free testing. So many laboratories, not all, but many genetics laboratories will offer free family testing for a specific family variant that was identified in one patient, the proband. They will offer that testing for free for a certain number of days. That might be 90 days, that might be 150 days. It could be, even more or less than those. Also with carrier testing, there are some laboratories that will offer free testing for the partner. That's, again, not every lab across the board offers that, but many do. And the reason why those laboratories are offering that is that it does build a clinical database. So it makes them a little bit more competitive in the laboratory space. That's their motivation. It can help with variant reclassification in some situations. Definitely there's altruistic reasons from maybe the people who founded that laboratory or the people who continue to lead that laboratory. But it does build customer loyalty in the sense of providers ordering from that lab. And I think when providers feel like their families have better accessibility, that goes a long way in establishing rapport with them between the provider office and the laboratory. All right, so now that we've reviewed all of the information about free testing, we are going to revisit those two cases that we've been following throughout our series. So the first case, if you recall, is a 5-year-old boy who has recent concerns from family and school for autism and a history of speech delay and motor delay. His growth parameters are above the 97th percentile. He's not had any genetic testing. He does have a family history of autism and also a family history of some cancers. And at this point, his insurance actually has an exemption to genetic testing. So what are some options that we should consider for this case? And this is where you all can join in as an audience.
Erin, from your perspective, what kind of testing would you clinically think is indicated? So insurance has an exemption. If insurance was going to cover it, what kind of testing do you think most providers would recommend in this setting?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I do think that one of the first things that providers are going to think about here is Fragile X. So having Fragile X testing would be a really common recommendation here. I also think that microarray is reasonable and a common test that might be ordered. I think that also people may consider doing things like a panel related to neurodevelopment or potentially even something like a whole exome sequencing.
Mm-hmm. And so knowing that there are kind of a number of different tests that would be clinically recommended if we are in the situation that none of those are covered by insurance, and perhaps we have to talk to the family about exploring different options. I know my experience working with Arkansas families is that some families were open to a self-pay option, but it was really difficult to kind of characterize, particularly outside of like a slam dunk clinical presentation. What is this going to do for us? What does this really, is this going to change things? And so I often found myself, at least with those families, having a conversation test by test and having to kind of prioritize, what do we have access to? Maybe I know that I can get microarrays covered through a program, and maybe so we start there. So what do we have access to? But also, which one of these tests is most likely to give us an answer, which would be probably whole exome sequencing in this case, with a diagnostic yield between 30 and 50% for non-syndromic and syndromic intellectual disability or delays. And then, so what do we have access to? What's likely to give us the answer? And then which of these would have the most likelihood to impact health management, things like that, which admittedly is a really complicated set of questions and conversations to challenge or ask a family to weigh in on. So all of that, just saying from my perspective, like if we were going to explore a self-pay option, you still have that work to do of kind of presenting a hierarchical approach.
Yeah, I think you're exactly correct. And for this particular patient, and for the family, could they afford to say pay for the Fragile X test out of pocket? Is that, that's probably statistically one of the more likely things, if you're talking about a single condition, could be one of the more likely things to be going on here. So could we get testing paid for from the family for that? That's a couple of $100 as opposed to a couple of thousands of dollars that you might have with a whole exome sequencing that's not covered. But yeah, I think that you're right. The whole exome really is statistically the highest yield, diagnostic yield, when you're talking about patients from this population. So there's a lot that you have to weigh in. What's the family? What resources do they have? What are their questions that they're wanting answered? Just like you mentioned. Anybody else have thoughts about this case?
I think it's also worth discussing, and hopefully someone will chime in on the chat. Has anyone else experienced this? Because I certainly have with some families, where after that discussion, and if no sponsored testing options are available, some families don't feel that that's, within their means or within their capability. And so what can we offer? Well, we can still, sorry, there's a mower outside. We can still offer a lot of valuable information and our most accurate risk assessment we can provide, when we've reached that testing dead end. But I always think it's nice to keep an open eye out for those sponsored test options.
Yes, I agree. So, and if nobody has any other ideas or talk around this particular case, I guess we'll weigh in on what we thought might be a good option for this particular family. So research might be the best place for this family. Whether I think that they could financially afford to pay for things like Fragile X out of pocket or the microarray out of pocket or not, if they go somewhere like the Undiagnosed Disease Network, there may be funds to help with some of those more baseline tests. I'm not sure, but they would have access potentially to things like whole exome. There's also a lot of research in general within the academic setting around the genetics of neurodevelopment. So there may be local resources, especially if this patient is being seen in an academic institution, that could help to gain access to things like whole exome or whole genome. Something like a whole genome, depending on the platform, could potentially get you the information about Fragile X, because some of the whole genome sequencing platforms are able to catch your trinucleotide repeat disorders. So just something to think about for this particular family, or a family who's in a similar circumstance. Look into the research options that are around. There's not a lot of sponsored testing right now in neurodevelopment from a laboratory perspective, probably because there's not a lot of pharmaceuticals yet being developed to address this particular population. And so, that does limit the motivation for sponsoring genetic testing in this space. So questions or comments on case 1 before we move to case 2? All right. Well, let's review case 2. So case 2, as you might recall, is a newborn who was born with cleft lip and cleft palate, also failed newborn hearing screen and has sensory neural hearing loss. This baby has not had any genetic testing yet. There is a family history of high myopia and retinal detachments along with cleft palate, and nobody in the family has had testing to date. So again, in this particular instance, there's not an exclusion to genetic testing, but genetic testing has been denied. So what are some options that we should consider for case 1? Or sorry, for case 2, that was a typo.
Could a diagnosis be made clinically?
That is a really good point. So having an eye exam for a newborn that is born under that circumstance, having an eye exam with an ophthalmologist, a pediatric ophthalmologist within the first year is very important. And they could find, myopia. They could find symptoms that are related to something like Stickler syndrome, which was one of the considerations of diagnosis for that particular baby. They could find other, eye findings that could be significant and relevant and help to narrow down the diagnostic just considerations at that point. So that's a really good point, Lori.
And I do think whenever a particular syndromic presentation is highly likely, we have a lot more options at our disposal. One, because single or 1 or 2 gene testing is often profoundly less expensive than a more broad approach. So it might be more feasible for families. Also, whenever there is a particular syndrome available, there is likely to be kind of a foundation support or ancillary foundation support. So in this, I would look for, Stickler syndrome foundation resources or support groups, ask around that, might even just do like a Facebook blast on one of their local pages. Also reaching out to some of the symptom associated groups like the Smile Foundation or American Cleft Palate Craniofacial Association to see if there's any support or opportunity, or to connect you even with a researcher. Something that providers might uniquely be able to bring to this, I've done this a time or two, and I actually did it with a P10 family, which would have been relevant to case one, but it didn't occur to me in the moment, as a provider, we're often having to read research and literature regarding these syndromes. And so when you see that there's a leading researcher for a particular syndrome, you can reach out to that provider and ask them, hey, I have this patient. We would love to get them tested. Do you know of any labs that can perform this testing for us as part of a research protocol, or just pro bono for sharing clinical information, making sure that that's okay with the family. But I think you have a lot more research specific options when you're dealing with a particular syndrome presentation.
That's a really good point, Julie. And I had a case in clinic a number of years ago, and it was a patient who was on a craniofacial team, so had a history of cleft palate, and we suspected Robinow syndrome. And so what we did was, well, two things. We did reach out to the foundation, but they did not know at that moment of any particular research opportunities that were available. There was a researcher who had published a number of cases of Robinow that was local, and we did reach out to that individual, that researcher, and found out that there was actually another group that was looking at identifying more genes. And for that particular family, we were able to get what we were trying to get, because we'd already tested for the traditional Robinow genes and it was negative on a panel. We were trying to get whole exome approved and could not. But because we had reached out to that researcher from the publication and gotten in touch with another research group that was in touch with them because of their publication, we were actually able to get that family enrolled in the research with that other group. And they did actually identify a gene for that patient. So it was really exciting, and it ended up in a publication, obviously. But our purpose was just to try to get testing for the family, and inadvertently, found a new gene related to Robinow. So there are things that you can do, like you mentioned, like it's a long shot. It does take time and resources, and the willingness of providers to reach out, but it is something that could yield an opportunity. For this case, do we have other thoughts, other comments?
We're quiet on this Friday.
Well, if you did not have the time and resources to put into contacting the researcher, you might want to know about the Amplify genetic testing program, which is one of the sponsored testing programs that we have on our spreadsheet. If you go to the toolkit and, just kind of walking through what would you do if you were considering this for your patient. So in this particular case, we know that this child has sensory neural hearing loss. We know that this sponsored testing program is trying to help identify patients with hereditary causes for hearing loss. And we can take a look at the gene list, and we can see here, this is not the complete gene list because there are 224 genes on this panel, but we can see that the collagen genes that are related to Stickler syndrome are present, as are a number of other genes that are related to congenital sensory neural hearing loss. So next, the thing that we would want to do is to check the program eligibility. So you would want to see if the patient had absent or high abnormal auditory brainstem response in both ears. And also, are they less than 5 years of age, et cetera. So if the patient meets these criteria, which they do, then we could move forward with sponsored testing, which is free testing, again, no cost to the patient. And we would get this ordered for the patient. So that is another option that you could look at here. 224 genes is this panel that's available through this program is comparable to the panels that are available commercially. In fact, it's actually more than some of the commercially available panels that are typically offered. So it really is getting you the same quality of testing that you might have been trying to get through a panel anyway. If you were only intending to get Stickler syndrome, you do get that here, but you get more than that. So maybe for some doctors, this would be overkill potentially, but there's always a chance that those other things in the family history were a red herring and that this child has hearing loss for another reason.
And so one thing that we were talking about as we were planning this session, Erin, is, kind of what goes into the decisions for pharmaceutical companies or a foundation and a lab to actually sponsor this testing. And a program like this not only is collecting information for maybe one or two foundations or pharmaceuticals, but the lab is able to have a banked set of samples with a particular clinical presentation, which they can send some DNA to this pharmaceutical company looking at this treatment. They can send some to this other one. And the broader the set of banked samples, then the more that laboratory might be able to kind of use that and send them out. And as long as patients and families are comfortable with that, that's a really great option. I think good understanding of what's happening after you provide a sample is always helpful, but the ability for these laboratories to have this big banked set of samples and then monetize that or the data from that is a big incentive for them to provide reduced costs or free testing.
That's a really good point. And I think the particular lab that's offering this testing did not, previous to this program, maybe offer genes related to hearing loss that often. They were not well known for that. So sometimes when labs are trying to diversify their offerings and like the space that they're known as an expert in, they will, they will make these deals to try to kind of gather that data so they have the data, like you said. So it benefits the lab to not just monetarily in the long run, but I mean, it benefits them, like you said, with like a base of information and data around that. And to be able to say like, oh, we've seen this many samples in this area. So other comments about this particular case or questions that we'd like to discuss? Well, if not, what we want to do now is to please remind you all to go to the QR code here. I'm sure that Abigail will provide a link in the chat as well, so that you can request your CEU or CME credits and certificate of completion. But more than that, we wanted to take the time to open up the floor to hear from you about just reflections of the total series, other topics that you would like to hear us cover in Echoes in the future, topics that or tools that you don't feel like are covered well within our toolkit that we could perhaps be building in the future. So we want to take the time to give you the space to talk.
And also, what do you hear from families? We hope that this Echo series moving forward is not, only helpful for getting some continuing education credits. We really want to provide information that's helpful to multiple stakeholders. So regarding this topic or other topics, What do you, or what are you hearing is a struggle from families as well?
Hi, this is Ashley Crowley. Can you hear me?
We sure can.
Okay. I consider myself first and foremost a family stakeholder with having children having some genetic conditions. I think this information is very impactful and very helpful. It should be something as a tool or an infographic or something for families to be able to come back to review this information and be able to have this information readily available versus just waiting for the information or a time period for it to be presented again. I think it should just be something readily available for families that, if they have a diagnosis, they can go to this link, review this information, hear this information, to be able to gather more information for moving forward with their families.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, I know we have hopes to be able to put this on the site in the future. So watch for that. I'm sure that Kara can send out an email blast whenever we do have that up and running. And we are designing a subset of our website to be a microsite for families for support. And this would be a good, I think you're right, Ashley, a good item to make sure is available there, because it will be a place for people to easily share.
This is Dean in North Dakota, and I just want to echo what the last speaker said. I think that families really need to have that information. So I agree with her.
Yeah, on our website, on the heartlandcollaborative.org, at the top, we have a tab that's for ECHO, and that's where I've been sharing these recordings and slides.
What other kind of dissemination strategy should we think of? If we create an infographic and we house it on the Heartland site, I can't imagine probably none but the most connected families might access that. So what's another way to get an infographic about, insurance denied testing, or you can't get testing through insurance? Here are these other options. What's another good way to get that out? How would families otherwise hear about it or access it? Where can we share this? I'm hoping you guys that just spoke up might have some thoughts. Yes, Ashley.
A lot of times within community groups or community pages, especially boots on the ground, family partners or community services or community groups. That's very huge. Word to mouth. Mouth to mouth is very, and I say mouth to mouth, but word to word is very huge, especially for families, because it's going to be hugely spread by word of mouth. So like knowing that I just set in on this today, I could go share with other families like, hey, this is something as a tool that you might be able to access or be helpful to you and your family. Those type of groups, because it's going to be felt like it's trusted and it's very trusted information. I feel like, and I always say this, that providers should have some level of accountability, sharing with all providers in the area, making a mass blast with providers like, hey, this is available. And, just getting it out there.
It's a great idea. And another conversation that I think has happened through the course of this series was after the first ECHO presentation, we ended up talking a lot about maybe like family provider friction, and how that can be such a barrier to good care if there's conflict or misunderstanding. I feel like that is another really rich area for a joint group of providers and families to kind of come together and discuss, because there are certainly we need to examine strategies when a family is experiencing conflict or friction with a provider. We need to work through strategies with that, but also really understand the impact of it too. So that was one of my other ideas of a potentially useful topic for an upcoming series, because I think that's something that really limits your ability to feel cared for, and also might, impact how often and where you are seeking care. But I don't know if Ashley and Janine feel that way also, if that would be helpful information.
I totally agree, because on that level, sometimes you can go to a provider and a provider can make you feel like you are not knowledgeable of your child when you're with your child 24 hours, 7 days a week, especially if they're infant. Even in school, you have that communication, direct dialogue and everything going on. And often the parent's point of view is not accepted. Very far and few do you find pediatricians or any providers that really take into account or accept, what the parent has to offer. It's always that we're getting talked at and not having a conversation. We're supposed to be, talking to, not talking at. And that is so common that, it's like, oh, well, we know this, we went to school, this, that, so, but we know our child. And if we didn't know our child and have some kind of concern or need, then we wouldn't be here. And often it's always just misconstrued that we don't know anything. And so it needs to be more at an open level and an open dialogue. And it would be great to have an open panel discussion with providers and some providers and parents actively involved. Like, get there and find out from the parents what their concerns are.
Yeah, definitely with the goal of understanding, developing strategies to work through some of that, and then understanding the impact of, if this is addressed in a healthy way, what could that impact be on our system and lives? And Erin, it looked like you were about to comment as well.
I mean, I was just going to completely support what Ashley is saying. And as a parent who is recently going through these routes of diagnosis and care with a child, I have been on the same end that Ashley is describing, of having conflict and friction with my child's providers. And I'm a provider, and being talked at instead of talked to. And so I am seeing a whole another side of it. I hope that sometimes I'm like, oh gosh, I hope I don't do that to my patients. I know we're all human, right? We are all human. And so we are imperfect. And that means that we don't do the best for the patient in front of us all the time, as much as we hope that we do and want to do that. But I think that this is definitely an area that needs to be discussed from a patient perspective, from a provider perspective. I think we both have room for growth. I think, a lot of the times, not all the time, conflict can happen in lots of different ways, but there is a lot of conflict that comes from the payer causing that conflict between the provider and the family. And so there's definitely that, but there's more than that. When a family says, okay, this is what you recommended, but this isn't going to work for us because XYZ, because of our child, because of our finances, because of our resources, or what have you, our family and our current state, could something like this work? Providers need to, I think, in some circumstances, they need to be able to stop and take a look at that. And isn't meeting them in that spot better than them not getting any care, than them being, feeling like, and this is me too, feeling like, nah, I'm not heard as a mom, feeling like my child is not seen as a child that needs care. I mean, yes, I think that this is a place that we could do a lot of work in.
Hello, this is Anita, and I would just like to add to what you just said, and the fact that what I hear a lot is that they don't listen to me. They're not listening to me is what most of them. And I agree that the providers aren't listening to them, and they're talking over them and not to them.
And I see Braden
So,
chimed in the chat as well, with some really interesting comments that, you know, some of the kind of logistical challenges of, you know, families can be the experts, and you know, they can give us so much information and help us understand. And then I just remember too, wishing I could impart some of the realities of being a provider in the modern healthcare system without it sounding like complaining or an excuse. I always wanted to share that context as to sometimes I did drop a ball, and let me know, or I will let you know, like I cried for 15 minutes before I called to tell you I dropped that ball and forgot to call out this result. Like, but and it's so hard to have this background context of all the realities of provider care and not be able to communicate it without, it sounding like an excuse, or to mitigate the really real and totally valid frustration someone may feel because a mistake was made. Or, I think there's a lot of insights and understanding that could contribute to the strategies of resolving conflict.
well, I want to thank you too. I think this is a beautiful way to bring this series to a close, to really bring it home about, because it's always about the family and the patient. That's the bottom line. And so to bring it back to that and to recognize some of the stories and challenges we've heard in this series, as well as in our own practices, I think is poignant. It's funny when you first brought this up, Julie, I began to think, oh my gosh, yes, this is important, but how in the world would we even begin to do this? What does this look like? Because of course I want to tackle the whole system, right? And fix everything. And then I listened and I listened and I listened. And now I'm ready to, post record stories and share them on the NPR story thing, where people can share their stories. So I'm really hearing what you all are saying, and I think we need to have some more conversations with our advocate work group and with the two of you, and see how we can move this forward. There's been a lot of work done around how to partner with your doctor, but I haven't seen this idea presented before about let's talk. Let's learn about each other's perspectives, and let's talk and let's learn. So I think, that's at least for me, that's a very fresh idea. And it may actually make change, perhaps in small ways, but it will be big ways for the families then that ultimately impacts, and the providers. Providers go into the field to help people. And it's a system that often stretches them so thinly that they lose their abilities to do that. Not their inherent abilities, but within the confines of the system. So thank you for a beautiful way to close out this session. Thank you for this wonderful series. Kara has said that these slides and recordings are available on our website. Erin has shown you where the toolkit is. It is a work in development. The microsite is almost ready for public viewing. So when it becomes available, we will be very excited to hear your reaction and comments about that. We're excited about it. It's a fresh way to engage with the resources we have, and you'll see a lot of new resources added this year. So stay tuned for info from Kara and on our Facebook page, et cetera, about the new microsite. thank you all very much for your faithful attendance and engagement. And we will be regrouping to sort of determine what our next ECHO series will be for our stakeholders at large. So stay tuned on that. And if you have ideas for an ECHO series, please send them to us. You can send them to any one of us. Kara is usually the repository for all the ideas, but you can send them to any of us. Anne, any closing words?
I just like to emphasize how much we appreciate your support of this ECHO series. And when we look forward to your ideas and also suggestions on how to make this better. And of course, we will continue to reach out to you via email, and also again, that these are found on our website and also on our YouTube channel, as I discovered. So again, thank you all very much, and we really appreciate this.